Hello, I'm Brian Kettleson, and I am joined by from Rangnickar. I'm really excited about SuperGraph. This looks like something I've wanted to do for a really long time, so I'm hoping that you'll walk through with me how to run it and what your motivations were, and exactly what it does, because this looks like it would really simplify development for people and cut a lot of time out of the development process.
Sure. Yeah, to jump right in, I've been building applications for a long time. I built a couple startups before. One was even in the Microsoft Spark program and stuff back then. And and the last from 2010 to around 2016, I was with LinkedIn, building a lot of their ads infrastructure.
Okay.
And various things. I also moved and helped with moving their front end from like an old GSP stack to more modern, kind of SPA kind of stack. And I after that, I kind of came back to startups, and I noticed some of the pains of building products are still around. One of those was building these APIs, and I'm not talking about specialized APIs that do really cool things, but more generic, fetch this from a database. I need this kind of a structure, more cruddish things and it's kind of a pattern that repeats, and it's repeated over my whole life, right? I mean, I don't know how many times I've written a user API, delete, add, remove, or products, and it's fine. There are tools there that kind of try to make it easier. If you go with Rails or something, there is like a nicer ORM. Um, but increasingly, I found myself using serverless products or Kubernetes, and these things that scale to zero, and I um, think into that environment well enough. And at the end of the day, I still end up writing a lot of code. So if you just try to fetch a user and maybe a couple of products, that's fine in Rails, but then you still have to update it and delete it, and you might need related things to the products. You might need a bunch of customer information, or some payments made on Stripe. Um, and all of this kind of, I saw myself rewriting a lot of this kind of code boilerplate, and I was looking for a solution. I looked around for things that generated REST APIs and things of that nature. And I kind of stumbled into GraphQL, and I really liked it because I thought GraphQL is a way you could define the structure of the answer you want from your database. So you'd be like, hey, I need product. I need all the users, the user who created the product. I need to know the customers who bought it. So it's all, you can kind of map this relationship graph, and you can just give it to something and say, here, just solve this for me. There wasn't, well, that was great. The backend in the GraphQL world essentially required me to write a whole lot of more complex code to achieve this. And that wasn't solving my original problem. So I kind of started to think of this in terms of a compiler problem. I was like, wait, you know what? If there's some way I could convert this GraphQL into SQL, and that would be just, that would be amazing. And a little one step at a time, I built like a Lexer, parser, and kind of took it from there. And the project started getting really interesting, so it kind of grows on you. And when you have these small wins, you really want to like add to it. And to be very honest, SQL is a very very deep kind of like it's a deep kind of space. You can go far down that road, and I wouldn't call myself an SQL expert, but I learned a lot. Kind of, it was my first time, I'd say, outside like the ORM world to really like write crazy SQL stuff that is, I would say cutting edge SQL.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also noticed a lot, I kind of stumbled into Postgres around the same time, and I really liked it. I thought, yeah, Postgres was like the ultimate microservice. It's got like everything you need. It's got JSON support. It's got a search engine in it. You can write a graph database in it. You can just go on and on. And essentially, but the problem here is SQL. Like most developers don't know how to take full advantage of SQL. And lately, I've seen that again and again. There's like all this complexity in SQL. It's not the greatest language to write and reason about. Um, so, coming back to SuperGraph, I started with a query engine where I would just take a query, GraphQL query, and I would write out the SQL for it, the select statement. And then I noticed there's a need to kind of build nested structures. So I started leveraging new features of Postgres, like lateral joins. And then I noticed that why am I doing all the JSON work? Postgres has pretty good support for JSON. So I offloaded that to Postgres. So Postgres builds the JSON out of these results. And at the end of it, this became a really cool querying engine. So I could say, give me the product, the customers, and blah blah blah, and would just like return me this JSON really fast. Um, Essentially, at that point, I was working on a startup, and it was a Rails app, and I supported that by having a kind of running this alongside the Rails app. So essentially, what SuperGraph did was, sorry, excuse me, it it gave an instant GraphQL API to my existing Rails app. I didn't have to write any code. It essentially went in, it requested all the schemas from Postgres, all the relationships, and it built its own relationship graph. So it knew if it had to go from a product to a user who owns the product, how that SQL needs to be written to join the two. So then it kind of started taking on an independent life of its own. I had a JWT support. That's how authentication happens. It initially only supported Rails authentication, which it still does. So you can still run it alongside a Rails app and pass the Rails cookie through it, and it would instantly get the user ID from there. The service kind of grew from there. I added mutations, in which case you can kind of like, you can do nested mutations. So you can create a user, a blog post, and maybe some topics related to the blog post all in one query.
That's really nice.
Yeah, so again, this was a part of the SQL world that I stumbled into recently. It was called data modifying CTEs. So you can pretty much have multiple, these with statements. So you can have multiple operations happen, and if you order them correctly, so if you create the user before the product, then you have the user ID available to insert into the product because you know the relationship between them.
Wow. So you're
Yeah, long
definitely.
story short, started like becoming service of its own. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I was just going to ask, you're definitely tied deeply to Postgres in this example, or in
Well,
this app.
no, I'm kind of exploring that right now. This is still SQL 11 standard. So if you look, I'm not using anything like very Postgres specific. There are, I've looked around, and even, the Microsoft database, Oracle, or even some of the newer ones like CockroachDB have a lot of support for a lot of these. I just haven't tried connecting to them. In fact, some of the newer databases like Postgres, like CockroachDB, claims outright Postgres support. So they will work with the Postgres API directly, and they support everything else needed to make that work. So essentially, I haven't tried it, but that's something I want to go and try. So there are even there are these newer engines like Presto, which is like a SQL engine that you can put on top of anything. And essentially, if Postgres talk to that, it can talk to anything. So for now, I'm focused on Postgres, but that's clearly something I'm willing to, kind of explore, kind of connecting it to other databases.
Okay. Doesn't seem like there's a need to change if there's nothing missing. I was just curious whether you were interested in taking on all the extra work of supporting other databases, or perhaps diving deeper into the things that Postgres can offer if you marry yourself specifically to Postgres. I know Postgres has a lot of really neat features.
It does, but Postgres is also standards compliant. So many people tend to think of features as Postgres features, but they're still SQL 11 standard features. And Postgres just implemented them before maybe some others. But that does not mean Oracle hasn't already implemented them before Postgres, or Microsoft hasn't. Some of these databases are just as advanced too.
Okay.
So it's just that I've not had a chance to play with those databases. And in the open source world, I'd say Postgres is leading in many ways, right? But things like CockroachDB gives you that kind of distributed database thing where you have like a consensus algorithm, and your data is in like 5 places, and you're not going to lose it, and maybe writes are slow or whatever, but you get. So those kind of databases have that, and flavor, and they can expand. You don't vertically, you horizontally scale them, and people are seem to like that. So I guess there are certain use cases where they work, but in my world, the startups that I'm working with and stuff, I think Postgres fits fine.
Okay.
So yeah. You were
Go
saying?
ahead. No, go ahead.
At this point, SuperGraph is, I've added a lot of tooling into SuperGraph that will help you go from like create a new app, in which case SuperGraph will create all the templates needed. You can actually even handle migrations in there. It'll handle seeding. So it's got a bunch of interesting things. So just to kind of step back, SuperGraph, I didn't mention this, but it's entirely built in Go, which
Okay.
makes it super accessible to most people who want to like add to it and extend it and take it forward. Go is really an approachable language. It's great to read. I've done a lot of work. If you look at the internals documentation, if you're interested in, I worked hard on the documentation. So the docs give you a whole working, how to kind of use SuperGraph. And if you click on internals, the internals documentation will show you like how the internals of the code base work, and how you can add to it, how you can performance test it and stuff like that. So we've had some contributors now joining in. There are people who've added things like health check endpoints and helped with fixing bugs around the relationship graph that it builds. And so it's quite exciting to see other people jumping on and kind of taking this in. Again, that's where support for other databases can come in. If someone's interested, that's clearly not super hard to take it from where it is to support another database.
Cool. All right, that website, by the way, that we're showing on the screen is supergraph.dev, and the GitHub repository is at github.com/dosco, DOSCO/super-graph, if you're interested in cloning or downloading or playing. So we're going to do some live sharing in Visual Studio Code, and I've cloned that project. Let's go over here to our projects here. I've cloned the project, and in the documentation,
I think.
I'm sorry?
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just explaining that I've cloned the project.
Yeah.
We're going to do a Visual Studio Code live share and walk through some of the features. I do have a couple questions before we get started on that, though. The application itself, does it require a Rails app in the background, or can it run completely separately without any Rails app?
It can run completely separately just by itself. So SuperGraph itself has, when you say new app, it creates a SuperGraph app. So what it does is it creates a config file for you. It creates a migration folder with an example migration in it. It creates a Docker compose file. It creates a Docker file. So there's nothing to do with Rails. If you have a Rails app, we have support to work with it. The example does use one because that's kind of where I started.
Okay.
But most of the people are just that I'm talking to now are using just SuperGraph by itself, and with and the Docker compose file comes with Postgres in it. So, and you can write the initial seed code to generate like seed data in JavaScript. So
nice.
It uses a Go JavaScript file.
That's really cool. Does the migration support? Are you leaning on like Rake and the Rails database support there?
No, it's all SuperGraph. So the migrations framework is SuperGraph like built in, and the migrations itself are written in SQL.
Oh, very cool.
So it lets you have an up migration and a down one, and basically takes care of that. So.
Very nice. Well, let's go take a look at it.
Sure.
All right. So just confirm for me that you can see the code on the screen. If you follow me, I think down on the bottom in the live sharing thing, there's you can click on my name and follow me, and that allows you to see on your screen where I'm at the same time. And I can do the same with you. I can follow you when you've got control of the app. So what I'm going to do now is give you control of the screen. So I'm going to follow you, and you can open up whatever files you want to open and lead us through. Tell me what's going on in SuperGraph, how it works, and then let's do a demo.
Okay, I'm just kind of figuring my way around this. And so am I controlling your thing right now?
You are.
Is it the one on the left or the right? I have two.
So all I can see is the guide.markdown file that you have. So every time you open a new file, it will focus that file on my screen. So basically what
Okay,
I see is the editor screen, and then we have a
got it.
shared terminal together.
Got it. And how do I see the rest of your code?
All you need to do is open up the File Explorer thing
Oh,
and
so that,
pick a
oh, so
different
you're
file
in
to,
there.
yeah,
Live shared chat. Oh, I see. So this is you. This is you. This is your code base. Okay.
correct.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Essentially, let me show you some of the config information. So the way SuperGraph does authentication per se in production.
I lost your audio. Are you there? Hello? I seem to have lost audio. Audio. So restarted the stream. Hopefully we keep audio this time. Please restart where you were discussing
Sure.
the YAML
The
file.
config file.
Yeah.
Okay. So there, a lot of the features within SuperGraph, you can kind of find them in the config file because they're documented here. You can find them in the documentation. Plus, you can, control them like HTTP compression. So if you're dealing with JSON, enabling this is great. Um, you get that for free. You don't have to like build a Go service and then add that. You can have this really cool feature here called remote joins. I'm actually pretty proud of this one. This lets you uh, query like a database table as well as a remote API at the same time. So in this case, if there's a customers table and you want to add, you want to kind of relate it to a remote API called payments. So you just name the remote API and you say, okay, from the customers table, take the Stripe ID, which is a field, and query this remote API, which could be Stripe's API, and take the returning JSON and join that back in with the result. So essentially, you're querying your Postgres database and multiple remote APIs all in like one request.
That's insane. Just that idea of a join on a remote API in GraphQL, that certainly shows the power of both GraphQL and SuperGraph. That's really cool.
I'm a big fan of this feature, and especially it gives you a lot of like you don't have to write all this code and maintain it. For if you have if you're querying like 50 customers, then this will handle making those 50 calls in parallel, and then collecting all that data and kind of putting it back together in the correct way.
Yeah,
So
that's really crazy.
it even supports role-based access control. So you can basically, so essentially there are two roles by default. One is a anonymous role when there's no cookie available, and there's a user role, which is when a cookie is available. So then you can, define things in these roles. You can say for users, the user table will always have this filter on it. This filter says ID equals user ID. So in which case, every request for a user, this will be inserted into a where clause will be inserted, which will say ID has to equal to the current user ID. So you cannot like fetch users that are not your own,
So it
essentially.
automatically scoping the content
Exactly.
to the existing user. That's really powerful too.
or you can control what columns are available. You can say, okay, these are the columns that are available, or disable functions. Functions are things like, aggregations and other,
Hmm.
more sophisticated SQL stuff. So you can control what happens in a role. And then you can say for the anonymous role, don't let users. So then complex level of ACL is called attribute-based access control. So in which the user, now that we know who he is, you can fetch him, and based on um, his fields or whatever, you can actually define further. You can like say, okay, if this user has a field admin that's true, then then basically the admin role applies to him, not user. So now you can create an extra role called admin, and have things specifically for him. Like the admin may be able to see all the users, not just his own user. So that way you can have role-based and attribute-based access control. Excuse me.
Yeah, very nice. That's a lot
And
of power just exposed through tiny configuration file. I mean, I'm just thinking
yeah,
about the amount of code that I don't have to write.
that's exactly what I was thinking about, and that's what I think about, and honestly, that's what drives me. So I know this is a lot of code for me to write, but the way I look at it is I'm not writing this again.
Right.
And there's a lot of like, when you have a service like this that does so much, I always hear people say that, yeah, but what if I have, what if my API is more complex? What if, in that case, well, that's great, because then you can focus on your meaty API. It's the stuff you want to be working on. You can build that, you can deploy in parallel. If you're using something like Microsoft, Kubernetes, there's your Kubernetes service, you can have two services running, right? And essentially it's not going to matter. These are really lightweight Go services. I mean, you can have 50. So
Nice.
like the entire Docker image for SuperGraph is less than 20 MB. So and it starts up in milliseconds. So you can even scale it to zero when you're not using it, right? Essentially. So
Very nice.
um, and obviously this allow list is great, because every query you actually use in a development mode gets registered in here. So you can build tooling around that if you need. You want to check privacy. You want to make sure credit card numbers are not leaking. Then you can just have a query that, or some kind of pre-commit hook that looks at this file and says, oh, these fields should not be in there. So that way, literally you have a easy way to look at all your APIs and what data they're sending in and out.
So that
So
that happens in dev mode. It automatically logs the queries.
it does successful queries, and even like the variables that they are using as a as a way of figuring out the schema of the variables and stuff.
Oh,
But
very nice.
so the variables are, so you kind of have an example, like this is a mutation query right here. So the user is being created. And then once the user is created, the user and the products he's connected to are returned. And out here, if you look at it, this is the variable data that's posted to create the user. That's his email, the full name, and the related products. So this is a nested create operation where the user is created and then two products are also created and added to him. So you can kind of like visually see what's going on and build tooling around it. That was my idea. If you look at there's even inheritance in the config file. So your dev file can pretty much, config file can have everything, and then your prod can depend on that, and you can just tweak a few things.
Oh,
So,
that's impressive.
and seed.js is also something I'm kind of proud of. It's again, this is not, I'm using a library that I did not build. It's called Goja. It's it's like a JavaScript implementation in Go. It's really fast. So I use that as a way of creating, letting people write their own initial data seeding scripts. I find it makes it easier for me to build an app if there's like data in there already.
Hmm.
It's easier to reason in terms of like even a web developer, and seeding scripts have increasingly got popular. So in this case, you notice it creates like 100 users, and it creates a JSON blob with a JavaScript data structure for each user, and then it basically uses GraphQL to insert it into a database.
Okay.
So you're basically using GraphQL again here, and it has all these APIs built in, like fake whatever. So there's actually a pretty rich fake data API built in. So you can actually get beer styles and beer hops and fake phone numbers and fake emails, and it'll generate them automatically. So again, this is a Go library that I integrated with that was available out there, but I exposed it through the JSON, the
Nice.
JavaScript stack. So it's basically I was trying to morph my own development, like to keep my migrations, well defined. I need a good seed script to be able to insert data. So, and it should be easier to create these apps, kind of maintain them. So when you create an app, you get a bunch of stuff in there. You automatically get a Docker file, you get a Docker Compose file, you get a migrations folder with a sample one in there. You get config. So you pretty much at that point you can just do Docker start or Docker Compose start or SuperGraph database setup, and you're good to go. So.
Very nice. Well, let's go play with one.
Sure.
So you should have control of my terminal. If you open up terminal in VS Code, let's double check and make sure that works.
I have terminal here.
Yep. And we have Docker's installed and Docker Compose is ready to go, and we're in a repository, a clone of SuperGraph. So should be able to Docker Compose up and all of those things.
Cool. Have you set up the database already?
I have, yeah. I did the original.
So I just have to do a Docker Compose up, right?
Yes.
Okay. So in this example, we're not really using the seeding or the migrations because the built-in example actually. So when I initially started building SuperGraph, I used a example Rails app. So there's a Rails app embedded in there, which is like a very simple e-commerce app, just a fake app, and I use that as a way to create and seed the database, and then I kind of show you how SuperGraph works alongside that.
Okay.
And there are way more Rails apps out there, so it's good to kind of support something and give them that another high performance GraphQL API for free. They can just throw it on and good to go. So Docker Compose. Okay, so that's pretty much it. It started, and and then I go to your.
Yeah, so you can watch.
Okay, so I can talk. So
okay, good.
What you're seeing here is a basic product listing on this toy Ruby app that I built, and he Brian's logged in, so he has a cookie in his browser. Now, when he goes to SuperGraph comes with a UI just so you can test some queries and stuff. So if you go down here, and this is the SuperGraph UI. In this case, what's happening is that the cookie that Rails set is also being sent to SuperGraph automatically because you're both on localhost.
Right.
And SuperGraph then derives from that cookie the user ID and uses that within its queries. So if you look at this query here, let me move my. So if you look at this query, essentially what you're doing is you're fetching a user, you're fetching a bunch of information. This is just the.
I'm sorry, which query are we looking at? The one that's on the screen?
We're looking at this one right here, the GraphQL query.
All right.
So if you look here, you're fetching users, you're fetching the ID, email. You're saying there's a field called picture, but there's a field called avatar, but you want to rename that to picture. You want to fetch products, but you just want to fetch 2 products that have a price greater than 10, and then you want to munch this together and just return one thing. So this user probably doesn't have products, so which is why you're not seeing any products here for some reason.
Yep, and that's correct. It doesn't.
Or maybe it doesn't have over 10. You can try changing that. Maybe say greater than 0. Maybe.
Strange. It says our server can't be reached. Is it? It should be running.
Is the port numbers changed or something? No.
Possibly.
No, you can ignore that. Try hitting the just try clicking that button in the middle. Yeah.
Oh.
It works. It's fine.
Okay.
Ignore that.
That's weird.
That's probably a bug. But can we change that greater than 10 to greater than 1, say? Maybe.
Sure.
I'm just trying. This data is like randomly generated. So yeah, click. Nothing. Okay. Well, I mean, essentially, you should have seen products there. Maybe the user
Yeah,
doesn't have
limit
products.
to.
Price of greater than
We
one.
can get rid of the limit
Yeah, we can try that. Yeah.
or the
Or just,
where.
yeah, try that. Yeah. Interesting.
Users. We could
Yeah,
get
I don't
rid
know
of
what's going on.
the products join. There's only one user in the system. Oh, it's
Try
my
this.
user. I'm
Try
not an admin.
products. You're
It's,
not. So
it's
essentially, the filter is getting placed, and this is your user. But we can
correct.
try this. Try products. Try another query. Say
Okay.
products. Products, and then type name. Yeah, name of the product, and then under that customers, and then a curly yeah, and then say ID. Let's try that. There's extra curly, I think, right there. Oh no, no, it's not. So if you and you can maybe put email under ID. I think they have an email too. So, yeah. So essentially, what you're doing here is you're listing all the products in the system and their customers and their email addresses. So even doing something like this takes, I mean, it's not super complicated. It takes a fair amount of code. And essentially, from my experience, most developers do this with like multiple database calls. So you fetch all the users, and then you kind of munge it together, and your front end service does the JSON munging. And in this case, that's not happening. If you go back to the console screen, you notice that's one SQL.
That's a beautiful
So
thing.
yeah, but people shouldn't be scared of that. Honestly, you put that in an SQL formatter, and the complexity mostly comes from the JSON functions.
Yeah.
So it's really just a simple join. It's called a lateral join. It's a new thing that Postgres has. And it's really great. And but a lot of the complexity is because of these JSON. You have to like at every step you have to build a JSON blob and then kind of pass it up on to the parent, and then that gets included. So
Yeah, and
that's
I'm just
why
thinking
it takes.
about the amount memory that you would use and garbage you would create in Go if I were doing this app, making objects and then joining them together and
Exactly.
merging
Yeah.
them. Kind of nice not having to think about that at all.
No, I mean, from a in a high performance service or high QPS service, not having those GC, not stressing your garbage collection is wonderful. And
Yeah.
what we're looking at here is actually development mode, which is why SQL is even being generated. In production, the SQL is generated when the service comes up just once. So your request goes directly to the related prepared statement in the database. So there is no compiling happening at that point. So it's even faster, right?
Oh, wow. So just to understand that clearly, does it prepare the statements just in time, the first time they're run in production, and then store them
Uh, well, it actually does it at boot up. So when the service
at
starts
boot?
up, it goes through the
Okay.
allow list. So and
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
yeah. So it's only the ones in the allow list that it generates. And another reason for the SQL to be complex is because even if you have roles, the roles are also included in that single SQL statement. It uses a case statement. So
Wow.
essentially, yeah, you will never get like two SQL statements. You will essentially always get just one. That's yeah, I'm stretching that pretty far, getting the limits with that.
That is
We'll see.
really impressive. So, talk to me really quickly again about Auth. I know you covered a little bit previously. You
Sure.
said that if you had an existing Rails app, it could use the Rails Auth cookies. I read in the site that it can use any JWT auth. So if you use auth 0 or some other component like that,
Yes.
I'm assuming all you would need there is the private
Secret.
key that you use to sign the
Yep.
token.
Yes. That's what you would have to inject into the service, and it would work. In Rails, it actually is it supports a few of the things like Rails 5, 6, and 6.1 have three different types of encodings and encryption mechanisms. It supports all of those. And Rails has another mechanism called session stores, where the cookie, the member ID is not really encoded in the cookie, but it's really in like a Redis or a memcache. And there's just like an ID in the cookie. And it supports that too.
Wow. So
Mostly because my initial app that I'm running this with is a Rails app, so
yeah, and that
so
makes sense.
yeah,
You know, you scratched the need, the itch for the need that you had here.
yeah. And if you want to keep all your rights to go through your Rails app because you have like tons of validations and blah blah blah, and you don't want to like you just want to use this for querying, that works too, right? You don't have any mutations in your allow list. Then essentially it's a read-only service, and you don't really have to write any code. You just literally deploy it. It will be, and it will basically understand that you have all these products and users, and this is how they talk to each other. You're good to go.
Really impressive. So can we, why don't I stop the Docker Compose here? Um, Put you on the spot. Can you show us sort of how the SuperGraph command works and how we would create a new app? Um,
Sure.
I should
You could.
probably
So
go
are you in the
install.
directory? Let's
Yep.
just do this. Let's do make install. That way it'll install SuperGraph in your Go binaries. So
Yeah, who knows where my Go path is set to right here, though.
no, it's by
we'll,
default, right? It
we'll
should
find
be
out.
Go bin.
Well, it should be, but it won't be. I'm pretty sure I have it
Oh,
overridden.
okay.
My Go path. Oh, no, I don't have it overridden yet. So, which is it?
So let's see.
SuperGraph?
Super dash graph.
Oh, Super Dash Graph. All right, so I have one.
Okay, so just type in SuperGraph help. So there's a bunch of stuff you can do. It even if you scroll up a bit, it'll give you like the version information, just so you know. Since it's updating so quickly, you know what's up.
Nice.
So the create is basically these are the database related stuff, and then there is new. So we can do it right in here. You
All
can
right,
just do
so let's.
test app SuperGraph. No, you don't have to create a folder. So, new SuperGraph new test dash app. Yeah, my app. That's fine. My app's fine. So now you have another folder called test dash app, and
Just going to open it in Vim
there.
because I'm lazy.
Sure.
So
That's
we
fine.
ended up with a Docker Compose file that starts
Yes.
Postgres. It uses the SuperGraph Docker image in development and exposes port 8080. And we've got a Docker file. And then in config, we've got our YAML file for dev and prod, a seed file with a nice starter so we can create users, and
And the
a
migrations folder.
migrations directory that shows us how to create users. Awesome. So if I were to run, what would I need to do to get this thing started?
We could
Run
try
Docker
a
Compose up?
Docker Compose. We'd have to do Docker Compose run super dot slash run what is the name
Dash
of the
F?
service test dash no it's
Which is
test dash app yeah test the name of the service within Docker Compose, the SuperGraph service. It's named with a prefix.
DB? Oh wait,
No,
I'm in the wrong
you're
directory.
not looking at yeah. You can just do a cat. Test dash
Test
app
app.
underscore API.
Okay.
Underscore API. That's the name. Run test dash app. No, you don't have to do that. Just test dash app underscore API space dot slash super dash graph. Let's try help. Just see if it's or version. Just see if it even. So what you're saying is you're running using that service. Are you in the same folder? No, you're not in test dash app. You need to be in the folder. Yep. Okay. It couldn't start a DB. Do you have another
Yep.
DB running?
I must still have the Docker Compose. All right.
So the same command.
There we go. Excellent. So
Okay,
now we
cool.
can
So we
run
can just
db
DB
create,
setup. That's it.
db
Or you can
setup.
just do DB setup. It does everything. So, or you could do a create, migrate.
Error syntax failed to create database syntax error at or near a dash. Is that in my migration? No.
Well, essentially, I don't know if this would create it. I mean, I haven't tested whether. Can we go back there and just take another look?
Here?
This is a starting point. I don't know if this would like itself load up an app syntax error near dash. Interesting.
We can try creating it first.
Yeah,
See if
I mean,
that,
it should create it. See, it's created a syntax. Okay, maybe that's something to do with that.
I don't know.
Oh, is it the name? You put a dash in the file in the name of the app. Is that not
Yeah.
accepted as a DB name?
Oh, I
So,
bet you're right.
so can we go into the config dev?
Oh.
You have to be in there. So. The config dev, yeah, and in there just change the name of the database. Scroll down. It's down. It's scroll down. That's the app name. The database name is below. Below there's a DB colon. Yeah, right there. So maybe it does like that. I don't know.
Just get rid of
Just
the dash.
Okay. Let's try that.
Oh, I should have
Maybe it
done
needs to be
setup.
coded or something. No, that's yeah. Well,
All right, so it
doesn't
created
matter.
it.
You can do setup.
Yeah, it already exists. So now I have to do it the hard way.
Well, you can just do a drop if you want to. You can do drop. Let's try it. Yeah.
Boy, it's super useful thinking about just how much is getting done by that one command.
I think one of the principles I follow is I want to really remove pain, because as a developer I struggle with a lot of pain with tooling and stuff, so I'm pretty cognizant of that.
So if we run Docker Compose here, we should only have a users table, and there's no allow list, but we're running on port 8080 and 3000. So just 8080 because now there's no Rails app.
Same thing. You just
so
now you can try
I should
users
just be able to query
and
users.
try users and ID. And you could try email.
And we've got our 10 users that were created with the seed. Nice. Super powerful. Now we won't have any auth because there's nothing set up for auth in this. It's not a Rails app. I haven't set up any JWT, so this is all just...
I think your cookie might still be getting sent. It just, I don't think can decode it. You probably still have that old Rails.
Oh yeah, that would make sense.
But there are ways you can, in dev mode, you can actually use the HTTP headers and you can set them ID. There's like, it's documented. If you do x-user-id as a header, you can actually pass in an ID. It's good for development, right? You want to change your user.
Yeah, very good.
So, and
awesome.
It supports some really interesting things that people will enjoy, like full text search. You don't have to go around digging Postgres documentation. You can just do search : and if you have the table set up correctly, like Postgres needs something called term vector columns, then this will basically write out all the SQL needed to make that full text search work.
Oh yeah, that's got huge power. So from a client perspective, what sorts of things have you been using to talk over GraphQL to your systems? Are you building like a React app or a JavaScript front ends?
So I have tested it with React and Vue, and essentially GraphQL is a post operation, and sometimes I potentially will add things for like get and stuff later, but it's a post operation. You can generally use just a fetch a standard
Hmm.
web thing. You don't need a client really. But if you do want to enjoy some of the other features of GraphQL, like passing in variables and all that stuff, and there are several out there. There's a JavaScript one, GraphQL JS. I've documented it in the documentation.
Hmm.
So if you have some JavaScript examples in the docs, so if you go to the docs, yeah, and you search for, I think it just talks about like the whole API. It's GraphQL with React right there.
Good.
So I recommend this one client you can use, and essentially what this is doing is fetching users and rendering them.
Okay. This is really powerful. I'm
That
excited
is how to add
to try this for
full
a
text search.
project. Really excited to try this for a project.
All right, well, happy to help. So let me know.
Very cool. Is
I
there
mean,
anything
yes,
else you
yeah.
want to hit in terms of features or things to show off before we wind up our live stream?
No, I'd just like to say that, I'm taking a lot of trouble to like at this point to like, help others kind of not just adopt it, but to also like, dig into it and, try to add things to it and collaborate over it. So just feel free to reach out. I'm, always willing to help. And, I'm looking forward to, having other people to collaborate with, kind of add some more interesting features.
Great. So once again, that URL is supergraph.dev, and it's on GitHub at dosco, D-O-S-C-O /super-graph. And you can follow Vikram on Twitter at Dosco, which I just threw up on the screen here. And don't forget to follow me too at B. Kettleson. I really appreciate your time walking me through this today, Vikram. This has been absolutely amazing, and I'm super excited to try something with this. I will definitely reach out when it's time for me to play with something and let you know what my experience was like, and you can count on more pull requests.
Well, thank you, Brian. This is great. Stay warm, I guess. You're close
stay
to us.
stay warm in Florida. I'm good.
Oh, you're in Florida. I'm
yeah,
sorry. I thought you
yeah,
were up.
yeah. I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt today. It's it's
Oh, well, lucky you.
it's
I'm
it's
in
very
Toronto,
nice.
so
Yeah, you stay warm. I'll be
yeah.
fine.
That's where we are. All the Torontians go down to Florida all the time. So,
It's right. Yeah, we've got the Blue Jays spring training down here, and
yep. Well,
yep,
maybe
it's
when I'm sick of the weather, I'll come down there. So, all
awesome.
right.
Then we can do some hacking on SuperGraph. I'd
Yep.
appreciate that.
Great.
Great. Well, thanks again for
It's
your
nice
time
talking to you,
today.
Brian.
Really excited about this, and have a good one.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.